So thank you very much. I am not a legal scholar. I'm not a specialist of international organizations. So thank you very much for this honor to comment brilliant scholars. And I hope that I won't make too many mistakes. In order to promote a collective discussions, I will, at this moment, raise 4 questions which are transversal to all the papers, 2 conceptual, 1 historical, and 1 political. So, the first question is, you all speak about representation, it's part of the title of the conference, but the great historian Carlo Ginzburg spoke about our deceptive familiarity with terms such as representation. So what is your definition of representation when you speak and you use this concept in your paper? If we follow the great legal historian Hasso Hoffmann from the School of the Conceptual History in Germany, there were 2 basic metrics of representation in the West. The first was the mandate representation, the idea to represent somebody else legally, with an explicit will at stake. It was both in the private law and in the public law, and it became a dominant paradigm with elections in the West with the revolution, say. And there you have a principal-agent relation. In order to have representation, you have to have authorization and accountability. But it doesn't function quite well with your IOs. Pitkin, this is why Pitkin had another principle, responsiveness. It functions a bit better, but we could also say that some non-democratic representatives could be more responsive than formally elected democratic representative. The other big matrix following Hoffmann is identity representation. It's a synecdoche. It's a pars pro toto. A part of a group represents the whole. The examples are numerous. The king in parliament in England, where the king and the parliament together were the part which could legitimately represent the kingdom. The trustee representation, we've discussed this morning. The idea that Congress has not to be just a meeting of persons defending particular interests. CIS and French republicanism, Pierre Rosanvallon spoke about embodiment this morning. And it could be only symbolic, but it could be also legal and political. And perhaps this fits better with at least a couple of IOs. We could see that it could only be symbolic. For example, these activists who say, we do not defend nature, we are the nature which defends itself, is a claim to embody the nature against the evolution towards the Anthropocene. But there are other definitions which are possible. We have spoken at various moments in this conference of the descriptive representation from Pitkin, the idea that in order to be legitimate, the representative body has to mirror the diversity of the entity of the constituency which is represented. We have also spoken at some moments about the so-called constructivist turn in the political theory. On this level, I mean, this is perhaps a difference with Samantha. It's a constructivist term in the analytical English and American political theory. Pierre Rosanvallon was constructivist much before this turn. Pierre Bourdieu also, and the German political theory also. But still, Michael Saward, who is one of the most important figures of this turn, has brought interesting inputs on this. And for example, one of them is to differentiate the constituency which is supposed to be represented, the animals, for example, or the most affected, and the entity that recognizes or not the claim to represent. For example, for the animals are represented in their interests, but it's a legal authority which can say, okay, you represent the animals. NGOs very often defend or claim to defend the most affected, but in fact they are more accountable towards their donors than towards the most affected. So, my question is, what is or are the definitions of representation you use in your papers? Perhaps some are good to analyze some IOs and others other IOs, but at least you or we all together should discuss about this. The second deceptive familiarity is with the term democracy. Most usually, democracy in the dictionaries, in the ranking of Freedom House, for example, this is elections and human rights. But again, it doesn't fit well at international level with your IOs, and we need at least a larger notions, and there are a lot. And democracy, probably as representation, is what Galli has called an essentially contested concept. There are discussions about what democracy is, and there always will be. Is it more self-government or self-rule, the defense of the general interest of the common good? Is it the defense of the interests and values of the many against the few, of the subaltern groups, of the most affected, of the most subjected, of the less powerful countries? Is it a substantial logic of equality? Is it procedural, substantial, normative, functional? So again, when we speak about democracy, we have to define what we understand by democracy. Otherwise, the risks to have conceptual shortcuts is important. Third question, which is historical. What is new? It's clearer for the representation of animals, but what about the representation of for-profit IOs, of the less powerful countries, of the most affected or subjected people? As such, a lot of dimensions are not completely new, and in the papers, even more than in the talks, we see that, for example, the participation of private for-profit actors is something which began in the 19th century. Even before, to some extent, we could say that the East Indian Company was a mix of public-private partnership with legal potentials and powers, but a private organization. So my question would be, all of you speak about new phenomena, new struggles, new developments, but are they completely new? Are there a qualitative turn? And when you listen to each other, do you think that they make sense together, or that this newness is unique to your field of study? Are we in a new era for global governance, say? Or is it impossible to draw common conclusions, or at least hypotheses on this respect? And what are the factors, if there are some, which push towards this potential new era? Neoliberalism, globalization, provincialization of the global north, the challenges of the Anthropocene. Last question, which is political. Is a democratization of representation in global governance possible? In political science, on these phenomena, the most common concept is global governance or governance. And this implies the idea that it's more informal, we have a collaboration between private and public actors and so on and so forth. The central idea is that it goes beyond a mere formal authority of public bodies officially endorsed with the capability of taking decisions. And there is a huge panorama of norms, legal norms of power and so on and so forth, which are as important and often more important for the everyday life of billions of people than the laws made by formal organizations. So in this perspective, the idea is that the production of norm is not anymore following a pyramidal logic. When it is democratic, then you elect the ones who are, or you authorize the ones who are on the top, but then you have a hierarchy of norms. But you have a much more horizontal picture. And very often, the sociology, the idea is that we live in a society which is a network society where all the hierarchies are no more efficient and no more effective, and where people are in networks and decision-making is made through networks. But very often this idea of a network society, according to which the idea of global governance is also modeled, is a very naive vision of networks and a network society and of global governance. The colleagues who worked on the pictorial representation of social networks make such a picture. It's an horizontal picture, but not all are equal the same way. You have central actors who are much more important, much better connected than others in the social networks. And my claim is that the global governance at the time being is a bit like this. It's perhaps horizontal, but in the center you have actors who are very important, like the US government, the Chinese government, perhaps the United Nations, but also the big actors of the new economy, Google and Twitter and so on and so forth. Some perhaps international organizations, the World Bank, for example, IMF and so on and so forth. If this is true, what could be the role of international organizations in the democratization of a situation which is far from being democratic and which has very often the opposite been described as asymmetrical and favoring the powers of the most powerful interests, but not of the global humanity. Thank you.